And welcome back to the second part of this episode where Tony and I talk about, again, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So hopefully you enjoy it and give us that feedback.
So I think it's interesting. It's something interesting to ponder. It also goes into another area that I've looked into, and I don't know if you've ever spoken about anarchism in your podcast.
I haven't. Was that the question?
No. Well,
Okay.
That's a question. Go for it.
So I used to always consider anarchism is like, okay, well, now it's just a melee, and people are just going to run around, and that is not the case. Now, I'm not.
No, it's not. Let me give you an example.
Yeah,
you and I are in an anarchist relationship right now.
Yes.
Because you invited me onto your podcast, and I am sitting here dutifully filling Dusty's seat. Actually, I'm filling your seat, and you're filling Dusty's seat. But
Close enough.
Which we'll bypass that.
Within one standard deviation of correct.
But the thing is, I can't just walk in here and go, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do today. Here's my plan for the podcast, and just take over everything and call it Mishmash Men. It's an anarchist relationship. It is built on, mutual trust, mutual respect, right? And so the anarchists in general, there were many who were violent, and they were,
right.
And there is a history of that, trying to overthrow things like capitalism and democracy. But in general, it's about the relationship of people to the state. And so you were talking about roads. If we have roads, if we can privatize things, let's take something modern. Elon Musk is flying spaceships.
Mm-hmm.
When we were growing up, we thought the government did that. Governments were the only things that could have enough money to go and do that sort of thing, or have the absorb maybe the cost of a failure. But we have seen his rockets blow up, and they celebrate and take data and go build another one and fly it, right? Well, that relationship of if I can privatize that, why can I not privatize other things? Why can't I privatize a police force? Why can't I privatize security? We do privatize it on things like computers, right? We rely on other companies to give us a service to help us be secure online.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of those things can be relationships. There's this notion that you have to have government involved at some point. That I'm not sure that if you really stop and think about it, that you would really come to that conclusion that you have to have a government that from the top down tells you this is how we're going to do things.
Right. So I have done some reading on, it wasn't specifically about anarchism or this idea of a nation state, but a lot of the readings that I have done, they touch on this a little bit about the nation state. The advent of the nation state. Before the advent of that, it was more of just like kingdoms, strongmen that came to power. Eventually, those strongmen started duping people into thinking that, God says that I'm going to be in charge of you, and so you have to do whatever I say because, God ordained me to be king, which that might be true that God ordained him to be king, but he didn't say you can do whatever you want to anybody. There's some crazy laws that were associated with it, even over in UK, that were taking liberties with people because of this monarchist view of the world. But anyway, the advent of the nation state is something that's not necessarily, it's assumed that we have to exist that way. But I don't think we necessarily do have to exist in a nation state type of.
Nation states are a relatively new innovation in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
And I don't even mean that we're not talking, millennia or anything. We're talking hundreds of years. If you look at borders, they generally break down along terrain features. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because the kingdom would extend to its most defensible terrain feature. And sort of endure in that way. So a river, a mountain range, an ocean, that sort of thing. That's where the term geopolitics comes from, right? It's the geography of politics. And so and you can correlate that directly to the most successful nation states are the ones that have the most defensible territory because they've been able to endure longer and defend their own country. And so that's a whole nother probably podcast. But I think you're absolutely right. It's, these kingdoms sort of naturally, like gas, expanded to their most defensible borders. And then that was what a typical monarch was able to hold on to. Every once in a while, Napoleon would go and try to conquer everybody else. But, typically he'd run into a problem somewhere.
Right. They'd extend too far.
Exactly. Overextend. You can also see that in reverse in Russia right now. Russia's most defensible territory has always been in that line of nations that border them in between them and Europe.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, the whole chain there, because that's where the mountain ranges are. That's where the defensible passes are. Everything that's to the Russian side of that is just wide open plain that you can take a panzer division through.
Mm-hmm.
And so the geopolitics of it have dictated largely, the geography has largely dictated where those nation states are. There's nothing really higher than that as far as the existence of a nation state.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very relatively modern notion.
So an interesting, I don't know if it's a thought experiment or I'll just try to walk the dog though, but if I, assuming the nation state, and it's not necessary. So, King A of nation state A says, hey, those people over there, that king over there is bad. He's going to try to take our stuff. Well, whose stuff is he going to take? Because like if he takes over he's not going to take over my stuff. So I really should just be concerned about my own property. So if you assume that, my property is my property, not the king's, and all of those individuals that belong to each of those two nation states that are on the preeminence of war, why do we need to arm each other and go fight this other team? At the end of it, the border moves a foot or a terrain feature away to a river instead of a mountain range. Why are we fighting these guys again? I mean, what's the point of this? Because you said so? I mean, a certain level of patriotism comes into play, but is patriotism a way that we fool each other into assuming this nation state business? Is that a way we fool each other into thinking, we need to go to war over in this other place because that guy's bad and he's doing things over there that affect us? Like, what is he doing that's affecting us? How is it affecting me? I know when we go to war, then somebody's making some money. Is it me?
It's a very libertarian view.
Yeah.
Indeed. Why are we getting involved in the foreign wars is
right.
The question, right?
I would argue because it's the banks, but anyway, go ahead.
But, and there's a sound argument for that. But one of my third question was on the common defense. So let's talk about that for a second, right? So geopolitically, I went down the geopolitical rabbit hole here for a minute. Geopolitically, the United States is extremely blessed in that we've got a vast ocean on each continent, on each border, east and west. We have the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, and so that's quite a barrier to invasion, right? To the north, we've got northern tundra and Canadians, but they all live within 120 miles of the U.S. border, so they're basically Americans north of the border. Don't tell them I said that. Do you have any Canadian listeners? Do you know?
I hope so.
Sorry to the Canadians. Yeah, my apologies. But the truth is that it's a vast, unpopulated area to the north of us, so that's also a barrier. And then to the south, it's Mexico. You could say at this point in time, we've got friendly countries to our north and south and good trading partners, and they are indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Notwithstanding other issues at the southern border. But so we're blessed with all those things. The fact that we've never had to defend against King B coming over in your analogy, King A, I guess, coming over and saying, hey, I want to take the United States. We've never had to actually defend against that. Pearl Harbor was the closest thing, and that was out in the middle of the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
In Hawaii, that common defense. I wonder if under our current Constitution, if we had been, this is back to your thought experiment. I'm trying to get back to, because we also chase rabbits when we have these conversations.
We do.
coming back to it with common defense, if we had been in a European state, for instance, located roughly where France is from Germany, say, and we had that had the current constitution in place and the current, sort of mindset about the Constitution, would we have been strong in providing for the common defense with a next door neighbor who was in easy striking distance? In other words, have we been uniquely blessed in a way that a weak Constitution actually doesn't matter so much in the defense realm, because we never have had to defend the actual country against an invasion of another country?
That's a good question. I think it's hard to say if we would have survived. I think we would have if you just transplanted. In fact, let's just say there was a hostile nation that was to our south that was developed and maybe on par or maybe slightly better than us when we formed the 13 colonies, right, into the United States. And, let's say they were waiting for us to a certain point after we finished off the British and kicked them out. Now they're going to invade. I think given the mindset of the people in the colonies at the time that formed the United States is we're responsible for our safety. It's us. Just like in Concord and Lexington with the opening of the Revolutionary War, the British were coming to take arms they were going to the armory, where at least that local population had their arms. They're arms of war, not arms of going hunting or target practice. And that's where they're going, and that's where the battle was before that. So I think the mindset of the people then is like, hey, and just like another good example is in Greece at large and in Sparta in particular, you had the idea of private property. They were always defending their property. So when they sent their men off to war, they were defending a part of themselves. They had other weird things about their culture that I don't necessarily agree with, but that idea of private property, that's important. And if you take that seriously, like, hey, those guys are coming to take my land. My property that I farm on and I raise crops on and I raise livestock on for my family and my friends because we do a little barter and trade. I've got to defend this because they're going to take it and they're going to take our wives, they're going to take our children, make them slaves, and they're going to kill us. That's bad. So I'm going to defend that. So if we were transplanted or if we had a stronger nation next to us, let's say Mexico was fully developed at the time, it would have been different, and they probably would have been a little more in love with the idea, the framers, with a stronger federal government with a permanent army. Whereas in the past, they were not big fans of a standing army at all. They did not want a standing army because you got to feed that army.
Right.
And that takes taxes, that takes time, that takes land, that takes resources, and they didn't want to give that up.
Well, and ostensibly, I mean, the only powers that were peer or more or stronger at the formation of the colonies were all naval powers. They had to project force onto the North American continent in order to do anything against the colonies. So you did see that from the French. You did see that from the Spanish at times, but they were projecting power from Europe navally through naval power, and so we had to become a naval power in order to repel that sort of thing along the way. We never really did need an army until you needed an expeditionary force to go to World War I for all intents and purposes, and then certainly for World War II. But the common defense question has to do with exactly what I think you were getting at with Sparta. There is, if I have this mentality of the individual rights and the individuals, and if I were living in in that anarchist sort of a mentality where our relationships govern our behavior, I still may need to collect a lot of combat force together, a lot of power together in order to defend our borders or to take care of some other security issue, some other risk, some other attack. And so there is sort of a collective, I believe there is sort of like not a collectivist, but a collective interest.
Like shared interest.
There's a shared interest that has to be addressed and all that. So that's kind of where I was going with common defense, which leads me to my fourth question.
Before you get there,
Okay.
an interesting tidbit. I've read about this multiple times. Most recently, it kind of reinforced one of the things that you were talking about there about the projection of power, and naval power was the dominant power. Like if you had a strong Navy, then you were able to project power and do your will and protect yourself from others. But the question that was posed by this writer, and I can't remember who it was, but it was a good discussion, was why was naval power so predominant in the European nations as opposed to in Africa? They had boats and they had a huge landmass and a ton of natural resources. So why don't they, or didn't they, and continue to this day, have these dominant naval forces? And not necessarily just the naval forces for protection or projection, but also the economy that is built off of trade through boats.
Right.
Well, just the way the continent is shaped, the way the Atlantic kind of hugs the coast of Africa, it's very straight coastline, as opposed to Europe and in the U.S. On both coasts, there's a lot of little inlets.
Sheltered harbors.
That's the key. And so if you have these sheltered harbors, you can bring these boats in, and then commerce develops because of that. Right. So I can trade with the Portuguese if I'm up in UK, or I can trade with whomever. And I have all these sheltered harbors that drastically change the dynamic for free trade. Again, you don't need a nation state for this, but anyway,
right.
That's kind of beside the point. That develops that free trade, which creates commerce, which creates wealth for everybody involved that's in that commerce, because it's beneficial to both when we start trading. And as a result, we also have the resources to project power if we elect to do so, or protect ourselves from someone that's projecting. But anyway, just an interesting thought.
So, and it's also interesting, this goes back to the geopolitics thing. The geography dictates the politics, right? Why has Africa not been successful? One of the unique and interesting aspects of basically the whole African continent, but certainly the sub-Saharan African continent, is that it's a series of steps. It's stacks, and I mean, 200-300 foot cliffs, basically that you don't have to get very far inland, tens of miles inland for the most part on average, before you hit a sheer cliff that has to be negotiated, has to be navigated. If I'm going to get the natural resources that are certainly inland, but if I'm going to get them out to a harbor where affordable trade goes by water, even in the globalized world that we live in right now, affordable trade goes by water. If I have to get it to one of those sheltered harbors, I somehow have to negotiate with tons of raw materials. I have to negotiate that 200-foot cliff to get it down onto the ships. That turns out to be hard.
Yeah, and expensive.
Very expensive. It doesn't lend itself to rail. It doesn't lend itself to anything really, that roads, rail, nothing. And so one of the things that you'll notice is that there's a dire lack of infrastructure going across what the military would call the littoral area, which is the area between the sea and the interior of a country, right? It's the coastal area. They just don't have a whole lot of infrastructure going inland to get to those natural resources, because the terrain's just too hard to negotiate, right? And again, that has dictated the fact that there haven't been for the majority of recorded history, it's just a series of failed states and infighting among tribes and that sort of thing, because they haven't been able to have that contact with the outside world, with the exception of South Africa, which has some of those natural harbors and some of that.
Right.
Yeah, some of that ability for infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it's
interesting.
It's an interesting thing, but again, it goes back to the actual geography of the place. So I have two more questions for you. Can we do two more? We have time for that?
We have plenty of time.
All right. Well, you said we'd cut it in half. We may have to cut it in three.
So, well, we're only at 52 minutes. So.
Are we really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So we can keep on trucking.
We're marvelously efficient here.
Yeah. Better than deficient.
I don't know about it. Yeah, I agree with that. So let's get to your beloved Second Amendment. Your
beloved. Okay.
yeah. I own plenty of guns. So the Second Amendment, as it sits today, I believe is well defended, and it has plenty of strong spokesmanship in favor of the Second Amendment, which allows us to keep and bear arms, it
recognizes.
I was going to say recognize. I'm going to try and use your terminology. The Second Amendment recognizes our God-given right to self-defense, to keep and bear arms. And you made a very correct, I believe, analogy about that could be an Apache helicopter.
It could.
People don't know how expensive an Apache helicopter is to operate and maintain. But yes, if you could afford to do that, then you too should be able to own one, right? But I contend in the thought exercise, in terms of the thought exercise, that the Second Amendment has become bread and circuses. It has become a distraction. And the reason that I believe that is because Joe Biden famously, during his 2020 election campaign, made an offhand comment, as he is wont to do,
Aren't all of his comments offhand?
Unadvised, offhand comment. He said, what's the NRA going to do against an F-15?
Right.
And so my point is, in much the same way that you made the point about that the purpose of a system is what it does, right? A corollary to that, similar statement to that, is to say, if somebody is looking to take away your freedoms, you should take them at their word.
Mm-hmm.
And so, my question is, that's great. I do have plenty of guns and lots of ammunition and great fields of fire at my house. But if I were attacked by modern weapons of an army, I just would not last, And so it's a worthwhile question to ask, because I think you made the case on the podcast that, hey, this right is reinforced. It is acknowledged as a hedge against a tyrannical government. I believe that that's become obsolete. What do you say?
I disagree.
Okay.
Yes, you as an individual would not stand a chance against, let's say it's the latest M1 Abrams and an Apache and an A-10 doing strafing runs. Artillery. Some B-52 bombing runs if they were going to take out Tony Moffatt in his compound, his wedding ready
compound. That's right.
With fields of fire. Yep. So 100% agree that you would not stand a chance. You would not last long at all. But the people, if they heard that, hey, this guy, he was saying he was a big proponent of, and he's not a big fan of nation state. Mm-hmm. He sounds like he's one of those crazy guys that thinks that the Bill of Rights, it recognizes rights that are given by God. So I don't know. He sounds
and
like
those aren't all.
Yeah. It's not an exhaustive list by any means. So he might think like that. So we need to take him out. But if more and more people see that, then you can try to take over a nation and key infrastructure and that sort of thing. But if the people are willing to stand up, they will eventually win. And when I mean the people, I mean the lot of us. If we organize, maybe regulate ourselves into a militia, we can take over any army if we're defending our own property. Again, all those assumptions are our property we're defending, not some guy that ordained it that you're allowed to have this property. Which again, let me put in an anti-plug against, or a plug against property taxes. I'm just a renter of my property, because men with guns show up if I don't pay my property taxes, and they take me away from my property. So do I own it?
They put you on their property in jail.
Yes. So at any rate, that beside the point, I think we could fight against that. That's one of the reasons why, like Switzerland's this great example of, they're a well-armed society. They have requirements to serve in the military, but you keep your guns. They train with guns like we used to in high schools here.
Indeed. Yeah.
And everybody knows how to use a gun. That's why Hitler didn't want to really invade the United States, because he knew behind every blade of grass there'd be a guy with a gun.
Woe to him who tries to invade. And by the way, before people start sending hate mail to you because of the question that I just asked you, remember, it's the thought experiment.
Yes, thought experiment.
Because
that's where I figured you were going with that.
That was exactly where I was going with that. I agree with what you said there, that that even now, I mean, we were in 20 years-ish of what in the military, we both worn the uniform. In the military, we call low-intensity conflict. I think that we're probably better prepared as a nation right now for combat across the nation, just for the number of combat vets and that sort of thing. So, and, again, because we've worn the uniform, I could turn that question around and say, would you, actually, I'm not going to do that to you. I was going to make you an Apache pilot, but
I studied hard in flight school, so I didn't have to fly Apaches.
Right, yeah. Exactly. So I wouldn't have
That's
to.
That's the way the OML went. Sorry, guys, it's true.
Sorry. I used to say that my parents were married, so I didn't have to fly Apaches. But in uniform, if you'd been given the order to attack an American city, I think that you would have laid down your arms at that point.
Not even close.
Am I right? Yeah. So there's this question about ideology, and then there's a question about reality, right? And so I do believe that the Second Amendment is strong in that it keeps people in the right mentality, if they understand it rightly, and so that's what you see is a lot of propaganda against it, that sort of thing, that to try and get you to think the other way, and if you say things enough times, people will believe it. And so I think that's the thing, keeping a robust defense of the Second Amendment. But I believe keeping a robust defense of all these especially the enumerated rights, is going to be important to keep people mentally on their edge, on their toes. So your wonderful episode on the Bill of Rights caused me to think, caused me to wonder that there are a lot of things that we see out there now, particularly in the digital age, where the philosophy is zero trust. So Bitcoin is a good example of that. The blockchain is a good example of that. It's a zero trust environment. For us to have a transaction on the blockchain, it's completely documented. So there doesn't have to be any trust there. There are other things that two-factor authentication is it's not a zero trust, but it's a low trust kind of a transactional sort of thing. We see these things in the digital world, right? A zero trust environment. That doesn't mean that I don't trust you. It's just that that we can conduct a transaction without relying on trust is what that really means. I don't have to
because of
rely
the
on
authentication factor.
Because of the authentication factors, because in the case of the blockchain, because of the documentation factors and the immutability of it, it can't be changed once it's in place. Or in theory, that's the way it works.
So you were talking about blockchain technology. We're not required to trust one another because of this technology to authenticate.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the question that came to my mind was, is it possible? So this is along the lines of the, asking the question, did the creators envision, or did they even think they needed to envision the proper form of government, or the way that things would run in 200 years, 400 years, 1,000 years from now? My question is, are we at a point where we could develop zero trust government?
Yeah, I don't think so. So first of all, my assumption in this is the Constitution is limited enough. It limits the government so severely that it's only going to cover these areas right here. The rest of it is up to us. So if that assumption is valid and continued, let's say we didn't ignore history, ignore education about the purpose of our government and the construct of it, and didn't fall prey to the progressive era and on and on and on and on, and fall for these easy answers to questions nobody was asking. And let's assume in all of that it had continued, and we were still like a well-educated public, and we still conformed, and the government still retained their tight little box, and that's all they were, with some little infighting and broaching back and forth. And I'm also going to ignore the whole Civil War, because that's a whole nother matter when it comes to rights.
Was it a just war or not?
Yeah, man, that's
right.
So I'm going to ignore that one. But let's just, for this thought experiment, I still think because you have it might be worth considering, but I think as long as you have a healthy distrust of authority, you should retain that healthy distrust of authority. And I'm not saying that the blockchain and this authentication process is not foolproof, because I think it might be.
It might be.
But because the human heart, man is desperately wicked, and his heart is deceitful above all things. We know that people in power abuse it. We know that. That's what history tells us. The people in power, and that includes the media. That includes anybody that's got influence, money, means. So politicians, people in power. We cannot trust them. We are not supposed to trust them. It's in our best interest not to trust them. It's not that we don't believe everything that they say, but whenever they come at us with a deal, we should be second-guessing, why are they offering me this deal? Because I'm happy raising my family, doing my thing. And what they're talking about has nothing to do with me. So I think we'd still need to retain that. I don't know if we'd want to remove any of those constraints of the government if there was a technological means to authenticate government. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. If I were to try to repeat back to you your answer in my own words, it sounds like you think that maybe the Constitution was an attempt to do just that, was to create a zero trust government, right? We're going to keep you in a very small, very tight box. And so it was an attempt at that. And I don't necessarily mean by asking about a zero trust government whether or not there's like a technological means to achieve government that does the things that governments need to do. I believe that, government such as it is sort of a relational thing. It's about relationships between people. It's about relationships between states, that sort of thing. And so I'm not sure there is a technological way to handle that. AI might tell us differently in the next 20 years,
right?
Which is subject for another podcast. But I think it does answer the question. I believe that the Constitution was an attempt to severely limit government, and to do it in a permanent and enduring way, a persistent way, to answer some of the atrocities that the framers had witnessed from monarchies and the endless wars that were going on in the European continent for centuries before. So I don't know. Maybe we didn't answer the question.
I don't know if we did or not, but it's a good discussion.
Absolutely. So that's the end of my questions, Your Honor. I don't want to revise or extend my remarks. I've talked probably enough at this point.
Well, those are good questions. I enjoyed the discussion that was.
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me do that.
So I'll restate my position,
Okay.
and there might be a small tweak to it. But through this discussion, I kind of I was able to congeal what I was wanting to argue for, but there's some assumptions in it. So in general, I think the Constitution as it was written was sufficient without listing a set of rights, but with the assumption that we did continue to train each other, train our children, train each succeeding generation, that, hey, you got to protect this. We have a responsibility to elect the right people that are going to represent us, and they need to understand that we'll vote you out of office, we'll impeach you, we'll do any number of things to get rid of you, because we don't want, if you're going to run off and run with scissors and do things that is not in our interest. But that's predicated on us training ourselves, us training our children, because, again, the state is not responsible for educating your children. They're not responsible to teach your child to read. They're not responsible to teach your children about government. In fact, the state, that's the last people that you want teaching your children about government, because they will tell you how great government is.
Yep.
And they'll tell you what the wonderful things that government has. And I want to teach my children you have a healthy mistrust of anyone in authority, including the government. If we would have done that, I think the Bill of Rights would have been unnecessary. But it would require a lot of work and a lot of responsibility on our part. And I probably didn't key in on that quite enough, because as soon as you list those rights and say, okay, these 10, those are your rights. Everything else belongs to the people, by the way. That's one of them. And then you close up shop, and then you come back 250 plus years later, and what you see is someone in the news, someone in the media actually said, these people actually think that the rights come from God. Mm-hmm. And not the government.
Right.
And it's just, it blew my mind. I thought it was a Babylon Bee fake news thing. But that's exactly what the framers thought. Again, not perfect men, but they were certainly well read. And they did a pretty good job of congealing a government. Now, this is also assuming that nation state's necessary, which I'm on the fence on that, but I won't talk about that here.
I think nation states would, I think natural, I think that's what we already saw. Nation states would, or make sense. Sort of tribes and areas would, or groups of people would congeal naturally enough. But I tend to agree with you. I think that as far as the ability, if you think of a nation state as just sort of like the ability to force one to war or to invoke some sort of trade practice like tariffs, counter tariffs, that sort of thing, trade war, or in our day and age, technological warfare or lawfare or any other sort of thing. In that regard, yeah, probably not worth the headache.
Right. Agreed.
I think.
Well, thanks for coming on the program, Tony. That was a great discussion. I enjoyed it. Hopefully the listener enjoyed it. We will have broken this up into 2 episodes, which is good. So hopefully you come back, give your comments. I covet that feedback. Yeah, feedback is a gift. It's something that helps me to kind of rethink my positions. Even though I am very strong-willed and opinionated, my opinion can change because I would be an idiot if I didn't consider others. So anyway, appreciate you coming out and helping out and we hope to have you out more because it was a good discussion.
I'd love to do it. Yeah.
So hopefully next time, 2 episodes later, Dusty will be back on the program, and we'll see you again on Mish Mash Men. See you.
Good day.